Okay, we are live. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to people like you. With us today on the program, we're going to be talking with Brian Matlock. He is a Republican socialist. He had run for U.S. Senate in Kansas. Their primary had just ended, and so Brian's not going to be advancing, but we wanted to talk to him about his campaign out there in Kansas, and we wanted to talk to him about what Republican socialism is in general. It might seem a little oxymoronic to a lot of us, but the parties have shifted a lot over time. So I want to see if there's maybe this historical perspective that he wants to bring, and maybe is revitalizing some of that stuff from the earlier 20th century. So let's get into it. Let's start talking with Brian Matlock. Okay, we got Brian. Brian, how you doing today, man?
Doing great, especially after that funky intro music. I'm digging it.
I know. Yeah, we love to get people a little jazzed up beforehand. But I think there's a lot to get into. But I think the first thing I want to note is, like, Brian, you're the first Republican I've ever had on this program. We've gotten to talk to a lot of candidates and learned a lot of lessons. But, it's been a great experience getting to talk to someone who comes from the Republican side. And I think the first thing everyone who is watching is going to want to know off the bat is, can you define for us what Republican socialism even means? Because I think for a lot of people that seems a little counterintuitive. Could you explain why you are running as a Republican socialist?
I think both parties have a major problem of not reflecting what the actual needs and priorities of average people are, working class people. And we saw that just recently with the Democratic Party deciding not to include Medicare for all or marijuana legalization, despite being overwhelmingly popular. So part of the deal is, I think we have this toxic two-party system, but a lot of average working class people, especially in red states, you think small town and rural values are often very communitarian, like we pitch in, we have a potluck or a barn raising, all these sorts of things.
Sure.
You help out your neighbor. You care about people and relationships over careerism and money, and it's really looked down on if you look down on other people or if you're just in things for the money. And so those values have a lot more in common with socialism than they do with the big business Republicans. Sure. And so I think there's systematically a difference between the leadership and what average working class Republicans are like. In many cases, it's the same with the Democratic Party. And so it's trying to form a new coalition between the good neighbor Republicans, as I call them, and sort of like Bernie socialists.
Okay.
And so part of that is I grew up in a Republican family in a red state, Idaho, and have lived in red states my whole life. And especially having been, I was originally going to be a minister, and so just my parents and that ethic of constantly opening their homes to others, donating, volunteering, raising kids who weren't their own, that I feel like I've tried to live that out my whole life, and I more or less went directly to left politics. And so the idea that Democrats and even progressives in a lot of red states have is we need to sort of drag these people through the centrist corporate Democratic towards left politics, and let's cut out the middleman.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I have to ask: is the main reason you embrace Republican socialism the simple fact that the place that you live in right now is predominantly Republican? Like, is it just trying to work with what you're given? Like, would you still identify as a Republican socialist, let's say, if you were in New York, or is that just a circumstance of where you're currently living and where you grew up?
I definitely a sort of Republican in the classic sense. I think it is a strategy of trying to, like, say, as a socialist, I think my commitments are to the working class, not to some party that doesn't care about people. And the sort of finger pointing that goes on and the assumed it's like the way a lot of progressives talk about it is Republicans are pure evil. If Democrats are also evil, they're really Republicans. And the whole frame is pretty toxic and alienating towards
Yeah, it's
people.
still very partisan in nature. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's saying, look, us working class people, including Republicans, have a lot in common that we can build from, and especially sort of like as I approach it, it's more about like a specific movement and strategy, but it draws more from like a libertarian socialist background, and so some of the emphasis on like bottom up, because a lot of working class Republicans distrust big corporations just as much as big government, and that was something I started saying that connected with people a lot, like Republican socialists, because some of us distrust big business just as much as big government. And then I talked about like the corporate takeover of agriculture. I talked about all of these things, and they're like, what you were saying was sure we disagree with some things, but that was making a lot of sense about the economy. And so there's all of this populist energy there. And so I think it's on us to organize that in solidarity with women, people of color, LGBTQ people, rather than scapegoating them.
Yeah.
Because part of the problem is in a lot of these areas, the Democrats just don't go there. When I talk to a Democrat from the state house about this race, he's like, well, we only need to win 10 out of 105 counties, so why would we waste our time and resources going to that? It's just short-sighted. They leave these areas for decades, never go out and are with the people, aren't centering their needs or organizing among them, and then they have this, like almost all of them are in this really wealthy suburban area. It's like the suburbs of Kansas City, and it makes up like 40% of the population of Kansas. And those rich Johnson County liberals, they just like, even a lot of Dems in different parts of the state are resentful towards them, and they're so anyways, so I forget what the question was. I had a point.
I mean, I think that leads naturally to just like how that coalition tries to coexist, because I think when you look at some of the reasons why some traditional socialists have been coalescing with the Democrats is that they do have this agreement on some social policies. We can certainly agree they will share some of the economic philosophy, but how do you try to have coalitions between Republicans and socialists on some of these social issues? For example, abortion and guns and immigration. Well, where did you try to land with your own campaign on those kind of key contentious issues that are really like kind of a real partisan sticking point right now between the two main parties?
Right. So a big challenge of this campaign has been to try to create a new language and new set of ways of framing issues that make sense to Republicans, because it's not like they are uniform or they have a lot of values that are in conflict with one another. And one of the ways that there's already a really weird coalition in the Republican Party between all these different, like, what do libertarians and white nationalists or evangelicals or like farmers, like all these different groups all together. And then they'll say lots of negatives, like, we're against taxes. And that can be like a rich douchebag CEO. It can be like someone who's really legitimately struggling, because in the midst of globalizations, like farmers, rural areas have been screwed meanwhile. And so some of the values that are in conflict, like what you see is already there's been a lot of progress with people supporting LGBTQ issues, even though it's not sufficient, but neither is it in the Dems. It's so like, maybe I don't know what a percentage difference. Let's say they're 20% more accepting in the Dems. That's still an issue, but like I've just tried to be pretty forthright and talk about it from personal types of issues, like when it comes to marriage. One of the state of Kansas Republican platform is we want an amendment to the Constitution that says one man, one woman. And there are a number of Republicans who don't agree with this, and some I talk to at like local small town, they're like, I don't know, I think like, aren't we supposed to be the party who supports like constitutional rights and protections for everybody, including trans people and like gays? And so there are people there, and it's trying to say, okay, we care about like freedom for everybody, protections for everybody. Talk about it in terms of like family relationships, because while some will shun their kids, some just have a hard time. And then like at the end of the day, like I really do care about my family. And at the end of the day, I love my kid, and I have to figure out a different way of dealing with this issue. And that's a painful process. But what I felt like, especially in the light of the Charleston situation, was part of I just felt guilty in that I had shirked my responsibilities of having uncomfortable conversations with people in red states. And now we're having this white nationalist movement gaining steam. And it's like, okay, Antifa, like, thank you for, I guess, like making sure people are safe. But it should have never gotten to this point. And part of
I have to ask, especially during this time period where Trump has had this major coalescing over the Republican Party, how has that relationship been with Trump's supporters in this ongoing movement? Like, has the people you've kind of built into your coalition supported the president and the Republican Party, or are they really kind of like independents and Republican socialism is more of like an ideology?
Yeah, I think it is a lot of independents and, like I say, good neighbor Republicans, people who are often less focused on they haven't been radicalized yet by far right media like Savage Nation, Alex Jones, things like that. And so, because those people are like really difficult to reason with, because they're just like, socialism is
it's just a different information set altogether.
But people who have not yet been radicalized, and they're just like people trying to live their lives, who vote whatever the dominant party is. Because it's like, if you're in a really red area or a blue area and you believe or vote different than everybody, you have to have a good reason for it. So you have to be like really set in your way. So most people just kind of go along. And when you're knocking doors, I had great experience with all sorts of people. And initially I'm like, okay, I'm against nationalism. And even my parents, who were Republican, were pro-immigration my whole life. Like, they were just like, well, if I was in desperate poverty and knew that if I could just get across the border, my kids would have a better shot at life, like, I would do that.
Yeah, seems like a natural incentive. If you want to have a little bit of a better life if you can, if you feel desperate enough. But, I'd love to now kind of like streamline this into the actual campaign sense. So, it's interesting to hear this kind of coalescing. So I knew you were running in the primary in Kansas in the Republican Party. What was the inspiration to run for the Senate in the first place? What were you doing before this campaign?
I've been teaching and researching economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Like I said, I was once upon a time planning to be a minister, and that didn't work out. Was working in nonprofits for a while, but became more and more interested in the big picture issues and feeling frustrated that we weren't addressing a lot of underlying issues and the whole nonprofit industrial complex thing. So heard about this socialist economics program, and so started there, and am AE and just kind of doing teaching and researching stuff while finishing that up. So I had this idea, kind of coming to realize that my move towards left politics came very much from a pretty continuous trajectory of trying to live out these values that I learned from my parents. And then just seeing this constant, like, the Democratic Party is run by lots of people who benefit from the status quo, and they are only interested in giving symbolic change, but they sort of feel like we're the only game in town. We're just going to keep stringing you along, and we have no incentive to actually deliver on progressive issues or for people of color. And so kind kind of continuing to see the Trump Hillary or hear the Kobach versus Laura Kelly, and internationally the same thing, like neoliberal status quo politicians
versus fascists. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There has been this trend, but like, what inspired you to run with the Republicans? Because I'm thinking it's a Kansas thing. Like, more people are like, okay, Republican. I kind of am already like, okay, this balances out the socialism aspect. I'm willing to hear you. Like, do you think that the Republican Party overall can swing towards socialism, or is it simply like almost helping the left kind of be more palatable to those Republicans? Because like, I think it's a hard sell for most Republicans, because a lot of them are with Trump right now, and he signals those anti-socialism waves. Like, is this more of like an educational campaign? Were you trying to advocate for specific causes, or did you think you were going to be able to defeat the existing incumbent there?
I knew there's no incumbent. It was an open seat. 11 people were running, and I finished middle of the pack, like 6th out of 11, kind of just under the like million and more spenders. So yeah. I think all told, I did quite well. 7,000 votes or so, without basically running a campaign alone and with no money, since like, I knew it was 100 shot, but all the other 10 were running on a I'm the most Trumpian candidate platform.
Yeah, you certainly had your own niche. I will give you that.
Splitting the vote, and then I was thinking, of course, it would take me going viral by doing something strange, because I had no money, no name recognition, so I'd have to have some way to get known and be able to do fundraising. So we were having steady growth early, but then we ran out of money, and my campaign manager had a lot of debt, so he had to quit and get a real job. And then COVID hit, and I was like, okay, I can't do my face-to-face.
Can't even do in-person stuff anymore, yeah.
It picked up a lot more in the last couple months, because I started to get a lot more speaking invites and forum invites, and so ended up connecting with a decent amount, all told. So I think that part of the issue is there's an alignment switch, and there's a lot of dislike and distrust of government, and like disapproval of Congress, disapproval. And what I noticed is some of the Trump people, initially I'm like, I'm pro-immigration, they're not going to like me. And then this guy at a Republican meeting, head to toe flag outfit, Trump, he comes up and he's like, yeah, man, these corporations got to go. I like local business. Let's burn this all down. Like, just sort of have this general, like, Trump represents a middle finger to all these, like, condescending liberals or something. And it's not as, like, there are people who are, like, have been radicalized. They're all about it. But there's a lot of people who have, like, again, generously, they're just worried about their life and work and family and doing whatever, but they're like pretty shallow reasons for voting one way or another. So it's just like, yeah, he's like, F y'all, you stupid. Like, that's about as deep.
He represents that alpha figure for them. I certainly understand what you're saying. And it's also like, when he ran during the 2016 run, he was really trying to go with this like almost independence vibe. It was him versus the whole Republican establishment. I'm not going to be bought by anyone. I can self-finance my campaign. I could say fuck you to whoever I basically want to. And so I certainly think that makes a lot of sense. You know, I want to ask you one more question before I go to some of my fans' questions. You know, I wanted to hear, of those Republican voters you were talking to, what like issues on your campaign did most resonated with them? Like, where is that line where socialists should be generally messaging more frequently to Republicans? Where do you think they're most receptive?
One of the things I think that, rather than like, you're wrong, I'm right, come to my side, is helping them see all of the ways in which they already are socialist. Like, in the sense of, like, I mean, the Republican Party, there's all this historical piece, which often people kind of glaze their eyes over. I can talk about it, but when it comes to the ways that they operate in their communities and helping out their neighbors and how they interact with their family, and just this general idea, like, we want an economy that works for us, not us like killing ourselves so that there can be a little more economic growth. We want an economy that looks more like a potluck and less like the Hunger Games. So you sort of talk about these values they already have that resonate more and kind of build from there. Okay, so you say you care about this, this, and this. So let me talk to you about why Medicare for All better reaches each of those things, whereas these sort of insurance corporations, they don't have your best interest in mind. They make more money from denying you care, and like, just show them some of the data, and they seem to, like, honestly, a lot of the discontent with the corporate takeover, because they've seen it. Like, okay, big Walmart comes, they put people out of business, and then they're like, okay, give me a $10 million tax abatement, or we'll go to that community who will. They know what that feels like. And in agricultural states, they know
it's hard for them to compete sometimes, like, because they don't have the resources already in rural America. Like, they don't have as much to be able to give in the first place. So it kind of, there's inequality on multiple levels. It's not just like in between people, but it's parts of the country itself. And especially these rural areas, as you said, are getting drained because they can't even play the game because they don't have the capital in the first place.
And then one of the other main strategies was just to try to talk with a lot of hope. It was very distinct from the rest of the people who were like, the biggest issues facing our nation are socialists and trans people or something. But I just tried to say, like, over and over, when it came to criminal justice, what are we going to do about all these Oregonians, and should we like send them all to the,
like, fuck, you're in Kansas, like, the Oregonians aren't going to do anything to you right now.
But just talking about, like, okay, criminal justice reform, I mean, it doesn't respect the police to not deal with homelessness and then expect them to like keep moving people around. It's not respectful to police to, like, we've already found ways that are more effective and more cost efficient than police to deal with drug addiction, mental health, like children and youth, antisocial behavior, all these things. And so talk about like what type of society we could have if we start addressing these issues, and talk about like the Green New Deal. Like, it's not just these, like, as much as it sounds to them like some coastal people who don't know or like them shoving something down their throat, they're not going to be on board. But talking about like, okay, we know in our rural communities how devastating it's been to have corporate agriculture. It toxic for the environment, it breaks up our communities, and it hasn't even lowered prices much. It's like 10 cents a pound on beef after decades of moving heaven and earth to create these like industrial feedlots and things like that. Like, regenerative farming, we can say, well, what do we want our communities to look like? What do we like? Dream with me. This should feel like a win for farmers, and we should be at the table designing this in a way that works for Kansans. And so just the type of like hope and vision and like immigrants, like, they're not stealing our food and our healthcare. They're healthcare providers, job creators, like all of these, like helping them see the possibilities and the resources rather than the scarcity mindset that Kopak and others.
I think you're absolutely right. Like, I do think that messaging is honestly needed in a lot of ways, especially with the Republican Party. I think you do have that two paths process. You either make an enemy, which is what Trump has done. He has demagogued many a group. Or you have to paint that almost patriotic, optimistic future of individualism and like just pragmatic common sense. I'd love to, like, the last thing I said. I said this was my last question before, but I lied. I have to ask one more. Sorry, Faye. I wanted to ask, this has been a particularly difficult topic, I think, for a lot of the Republicans that I've known, is handling the subject of just race and identity politics in general. Do you try to have any dialogue on that specifically, or do you try to focus on just universal topics like a healthcare, as you said, like the environment? Do you try to go to that level of inequality in the conversations you drive, or do you think that's counterproductive?
I think it's absolutely necessary, and part of that is, but I think my attack is by showing the ways in which we have a lot in common. Like in a way, it's sort of going from like a martial arts where you're striking to more of a like jiu-jitsu, like use the energy, like because what they do is they resist and they push back, and they have this whole mythology for why it's okay for them to do it that, but it's part of their fundamental understanding that they are not racist. They're like, Republican, ever heard of like the Civil
Lincoln.
War?
Yeah.
What about first Republican black senator, 1880s or something, and first Democratic black senator, 1980s? And so it's like it's important to their self-concept. So rather than say, "Nuh-uh, you suck," Southern strategy, just say like, "Okay, listen, tearing down statue, no statue is a meaningless debate. Like it's sort of the symbolic war. What's really going on is they feel like this country, they do not feel safe and valued and honored in this country. If you say you're not racist, like, okay, like whatever, you want a statue, that's neither here nor there. How do we show that to them that you care? Like, how do we listen? How do we build something?" And then also we need to emphasize the ways that they share a lot. Like Democrats are kind of the paternalistic party. They're more like, they love,
a lot with the means testing of welfare too has that vibe of like, yeah, prove you're worthy, do all this paperwork, and then we'll help you. We're gonna invade your privacy, and
And it's like they love to hear about struggling people, and they love to all these things, but they don't want to. They give symbolic aid.
Like if we abolished poverty, what would they have to talk about? Like just start solving these problems or propose comprehensive things compared to these means testing. But go on. You were going into how like we can't basically have this like lack of freedom in a sense. Like they're trying to control how we get helped. Prove your worth to be helped.
Yeah, and they like, and so just talking about how like a lot of the libertarian socialist criticisms that were doing like radical community level organizing through the post-war era, they had similar critiques of the welfare state that Republicans have in a sense, like they took it a very different way, but saying like, okay, so you're actively disgusting from communities, you're doing all this racist nonsense, but then you're like, here is some bare subsistence check to let you like suffer through this continued decline, but it doesn't provide any solutions or way forward. And so instead talking about like how do we empower local communities through participatory budgeting and a locally administered job but federally funded job guarantee so that there's more democratic decision making over federal funds so that it's supporting local efforts rather than centralizing decision making. But then talking about how their interests are in common with immigrants and people of color is another tack. Like you can't just, oh, look at these poor wretches, help them out like you can with the Dems, but rather saying, look how what they're experiencing is similar to what we're experiencing. In the countries where immigrants are moving out, it's similar to rural Kansas where all your kids can't find jobs and opportunities, so they move to the city and they never come back. Yeah. We're all competing and being displaced by multinational corporations. And so you talk about how we're sharing a lot of similar things. And I do try to say, even with the education system being funded by property taxes, so rich people in white blight suburbs get to keep their money for their kids.
Yeah.
It's like that affects poor white rural areas and poor minority.
Yeah, it happens to kind of be racial because there's that poverty gap too. Like that already exists. But like if you're poor and white, they can treat you the same as they're treating these discriminated minority groups a lot of the times. I'm not saying that it's always going to be the same. I think there are extra struggles that certain communities face by certain powerful institutions, like, for example, policing. But yeah, a poor white person is going to honestly face a lot of what the Black and brown communities would admit is the discrimination they're facing today.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting. I think a lot of the things like, I think of cultural appropriation. That's something, a lot of the similar dynamics to rural people. It's like you have people in cities who are like, oh, backwards, inbred, redneck, hicks, whatever. But then it's like, ooh, flannel, banjos, PPR. Like, they just keep appropriating, and they make all of this money off of someone else's culture, but then they demean these people. Those people are a lot poorer. And so the sorts of things that they feel, these resentment, helping them understand and see the ways that there are similar dynamics with people of color and immigrants. But I still try to recognize very clearly, yes, but like with education, a poor white school district still gets on average $2,000 more per student than a poor Black school district, because the school district, like breaking away and starting their own school district, was a very white flight racialized process. And so it affects everybody who's poor, but it affects along racial lines even worse. So just saying so we got to address it, but that's going to help all of us, like, because we all want our kids to have those opportunities and things like that.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I do think it's very important, as you've been kind of alluding to. It's a messaging thing. It's listening. It's not judging. It's kind of the way we conduct ourselves that's very important in how we reach these types of voters in general. And that, frankly, look at them like they're humans. Like, at the end of the day, like I always say, like, even when you're running against anyone as an enemy, like, they're gonna be your constituent at the end of the day most of the time. And so you should want to, like, respect them and listen to them and work with them if you can, for where you agree, and where you don't, you keep having that conversation to see who can win out. But, Brian, thank you for answering my questions. I'd love to go to a couple of my fans' questions before we wrap up today. The first question I have here comes from Nelson Orta. Nelson asks, do you think a wealth tax can be effective?
I guess that, can it be effective in what way? Reducing inequality or raising?
Like, would you accept or embrace a wealth tax and trying to fund things that you would look to try and enact?
I am definitely would consider a wealth tax not to fund things. I'm sorry, I'm a modern money theorist economist, and okay. So taxes do not fund federal spending. And so I think there are social policies that are social objectives. I don't think you can have a functioning democracy and have the type of inequality we have. It is bad for democracy, and higher marginal tax rates induce people to reinvest money rather than to just live in opulence and saying let them eat cake. Like when you get a super high marginal tax rate or things like that, induces them to keep investing. So I think there are social objectives that could be reached by that. I haven't done enough research specifically on a wealth tax, so honestly, at the end of the day, I'm like, I need to look at that more to see if that's something that's viable. But
yeah, I kind of agree with your general philosophy. I use a little bit of a variant in consumer monetary theory compared to modern monetary theory. But I agree with you that you don't necessarily need to be funding all these programs through taxation as a funding base. You're just trying to control for that inflationary impact of stimulus spending. But, I do wonder, what cases do you use for taxation? Because, for instance, one of the reasons why I don't like a wealth tax is because when you look at where it's been tried out so far, there's been 12 countries so far, primarily European, that have tried it out, and 9 of them ended up saying they didn't want to use it. It was an inefficient tax. They had a lot of capital flight. And the second problem is, in addition to feeling like it might not be effective, I worry that it's not even constitutional here in America. Because it's a direct proportional tax. Non-proportional tax. And so that would be a violation of our Constitution. But I'd love to hear, in your opinion, just like what taxes should be used. And like, as you said, we're using them for other social or incentive purposes. What are some taxes that you do think need to be updated?
I think to an extent it depends on the situation. So from the federal level, or like I know in Kansas we have an immense amount of regressive taxes. Like, let's just have one of the highest food taxes in the country while we're cutting property taxes. And so I definitely think that tends to hurt the people struggling the most. Overall, I think it depends. I mean, I think especially as we're running into a recession and potentially a depression, we should generally be reducing taxes pretty much across the board, but especially for people who are having the most trouble. One of my professors during the global financial crisis was, let's just do a federal tax holiday for a couple of years until the economy picks back up. I can't think of a more Republican way to deal with a recession than to have a federal tax holiday. But I don't know. Again, I think I tend to think the larger individual consumers and businesses get, the more they have the capability of fixing the markets in order that they're more able to win. And they, as we've seen, just are able to kind of buy our democracy and decide who gets elected. And so it's not good for society for someone to have at that much. So I think, I don't know. I haven't gotten into the weeds a lot on tax policy.
Sure. Fair enough. Let's go to another question that we got here. So this is from Ravi Patel. He asked, Brian, how do you feel about the prospect of selling the Green New Deal to Republicans? He feels like it's one of the things that they could get them on board with is climate change. In your experience, has there been already receptivity to climate change being a reality? And for those that are resistant, what usually do they bring up in not wanting to address it?
I have tried to bring it up in a bit of a different way because it has been so politicized, which is very unfortunate. But I try to talk about it in concrete terms that are very difficult to argue with. Like, fossil fuels are finite. We're going to run out of them eventually, and we're going to have to switch to something else. They make our air and water quality worse. Like, we can either keep kicking it down the road or we can address it now. Similarly, plastics have only been around a single generation, and they are already piling up around the world, filling our oceans. Like, we can't keep just pretending these problems don't exist, pretending they're going to be taken care of. And we have the opportunity, as we're transitioning towards more sustainable agriculture, towards a more sustainable energy usage, that already fits some of their goals. Like, they want more local control and not as much dependent on foreign oil.
Yeah.
They like, and then talking about agriculture, because again, you have to really talk about it in the ways that they've seen their communities dying. And even though a lot of people in agriculture, they sort of feel like this cult of efficiency is the only game in town, there's nothing else possible. But if you ask them, like, what do you wish? It was, I wish we could turn back time 40 years on agriculture, back to more like family farms and tighter knit communities and things like that. So talking about, like, we get to decide what we want agriculture to look like. And so having like a new Homestead Act where we have the start of like more people, that's hopefully less genocidal than the last one. But that brings more people to farming cooperatives, to like local. And so talking about all of the possibilities, and I emphasize like it's an open document. I mean, the document's like 10 to 15 pages or something, and it's just really broad. We can be designing it to say, what kind of society do we want? And that's a really huge opportunity we have. So talk about it in concrete terms with optimism, and talk about it like based on the needs and experiences of people here. And I haven't gotten pushback really. They're just like, because it evades the standard talking points about like,
oh yeah, I like the way you're talking about this. One, like, it's a lot more tangible, seeable, understandable when you put it in those environmental terms compared to the idea of just climate change. Like the idea of temperatures rising doesn't necessarily put a visceral image other than maybe the icebergs are going to melt. And if you're in Kansas, like, are you going to make that connection of what the icebergs melting means to you in the middle of Kansas? No, but you can kind of give that imagery of the environmental impact in their area of just general pollution a lot of the times of what is caused by these fossil fuels, and that shouldn't be just seen as a threat and existential terror. It should be looked at as an opportunity to reimagine other systems of how we're doing things today. I really like that approach of how we can talk to these issues with adversaries in general, not just conservatives, but just in general, how we can talk to people. Because I think we really need to visualize stuff and understand how it helps us, not just how it doesn't harm us. Okay, let's go to another question here. Let's go with our last question here. I see two questions here I'd like to do. So the second one I wanted to do here is, when you talk to Trump supporters, just in general, what has been the main sticking points for him going forward? Do you think it's more of a they like what he is putting out there and there's something specific, or is it more of a dislike of the Democrats themselves?
I think it's a few things. Why Trump is not an American phenomenon, but he is a global phenomenon. Like, we're seeing the same type of figures pop up around the world. So it's sort of an absurd liberal hysteria to be like, oh, we had this great nation and then Trump came along. No, at the fear of sounding too materialist, it's the economy, stupid. You see, the very same thing happened during the last free trade globalization 100 years ago, when they're on the gold standard. There's austerity being enforced so that stable exchange rates and all these sorts of things. So you have individual farmers, raw material producers who are competing with everybody on the globe who's producing the same thing. But then in order to coordinate these global trades, you have these multinational corporations and never before seen inequality. They have monopolies, property rights, control the supply lines. So they are protected from competition and just suck all of this wealth that's being created. Meanwhile, people get squeezed out. What this does when you're reforming agriculture, or when you're suddenly putting in a factory that can produce enough of something for half the world, you're putting out of business all of these local producers. And so what happens is massive displacement, like rural to urban and poor countries to wealthier countries. So at the very same time people are being squeezed out, they're also being displaced. And so it's easy for fascists to say, it's their fault. All these poor men, these immigrants, it's their fault. So being able to provide a better narrative of what are we experiencing and how did we get here, which I think Democrats wholesale fail to do. They're just like, no, we were great under Obama, because all these suburban, wealthy, comfortable financiers. Anyways, so freaking Wall Street lives. So instead, talking about in ways that make sense to them, to narrate what they've experienced so it resonates, like, yeah, that's what I've been experiencing and that sucks. But then talk about the solutions in a way, and even just kind of off the cuff, like talking about local ownership. So you can use, because they like local businesses and small, and they don't trust corporations. So even talking about cooperatives or participatory budgeting or like local finance and credit cooperatives and all sorts of different things, which help them get the things that they already say they want. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to be doing that. And again, part of it is I read a really insightful article by some libertarian publication. It was basically talking about the ways in which Donald Trump is his politics are like kayfabe or like the wrestling.
yeah. I could get that vibe a little.
I'm the jail man and I jail people. Like you just have some gimmick and you do that over and over, and you have the good guy versus the bad guy. And your point, in a way, it's also like a rap battle. Your point isn't to like give a good argument or do so, it's to make the crowd cheer. Like, yeah, oh, got him. Like, and so we're in the midst of this senseless, just like you see with Kamala Harris getting it. We're hearing Republicans like outraged about her mass incarceration and her track record on criminal.
Like, come on, you would vote the same way. You'd make the same decision.
Well, it's what it points out. I request that you not frame it that way, because what it's doing is it's saying you guys operate like that rather than realize that's how all people operate. Dems do the exact same thing. You're like, oh, law and order, and then
fair enough. Neither side is doing a particularly great job on this topic at the moment.
That's fine. I mean, my guy did it, so that's fine. Your person did it. That's evil. So it's just recognizing that I think when socialists reach out in both parties and outside of either party, like we're better able to critique the other people, because democratic socialists who are dependent on the democratic machinery are like mind their P's and Q's a bit more. And so coming from the right gives me the opportunity to say things about the Democrats that they can't say. And just like bashing libs is one of the things that socialists and Republicans most like have in common, right? Like
it's true. You know, it's an interesting approach of having not like a one caucus within a party or one independent party separated from both of the parties, but like just a kind of a socialist caucus that is in both parties as a concept, and like just running in the specific area you're in. Because I think that is certainly a kind of core philosophy I've always talked about here on the channel, which is like you should talk to people in the language they want to hear so that they can kind of gain trust with you, so that you can kind of take them in a direction you need to take them. Like speak in their language. Like it's going to be a lot harder if you use terminology and values that aren't theirs already. Like put it in their terminology. So I think that's really important. So let's go with one last question here, Brian. I think this is a great way to transition out. Our guest here, Medicare for All, please asks, what are your plans for 2022? Maybe not 2022 itself, but do you have any plans to continue doing this through an electoral process, or are you going to just be an activist beyond this election cycle?
I'm definitely considering it and weighing my options. I think I'm open to a number of different things, like if there were other candidates or organizations that were doing stuff I was real excited about, I'd be happy to help them out. I think I do well in that capacity, like kind of an academic who has a drama nerd background, and so like kind of the ability to talk about the issues excitedly and things like I really enjoyed that. And so something, I'm currently jobless, so if anyone wants to, got the connection, but I've been applying to also like teaching jobs, policy jobs, all sorts of stuff. So after you find him a job, then you have to think about it.
Well, Brian, thank you for letting us know the future plans there. We certainly will hope to have you back sometime, because you know what? I think this is a very interesting approach to both the socialism side and to republicanism. And we didn't even go into as much the policies. So much of today was just getting to talk about messaging and how do you like solve this polarization out there. We got a lot more to explore, but thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciated getting to talk to you and get to know you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, John. I appreciate it.
Okay. Okay, guys. So that was Brian. I want to thank him again for coming on to the program tonight. I really appreciated getting to learn Republican socialism is a thing. You know, I thought this was basically a foregone system, kind of evaporated in the 1930s once like FDR came along. But, you know, I think it's a very smart approach to sell things this way. And I think it really kind of goes to even some of those values that like Andrew Yang was talking about. Treat people like humans first. Talk to them in their term. Let's focus on these kind of, as he was talking about, like just common folk, good people out there. There are a lot more reachable people than we give credit. So want to thank him again for coming on today. With that being said, let's give you a final programming update to close out today's episode. So tomorrow we're going to be having a debate. It's going to be a return of regular debates here on the program. We're going to be doing them every other week. This first one that we're doing will be on universal basic income. We just had our debunk session with two of our experts, Scott Santens, as well as Carl Witterquist. So it'll be myself against this person named Daniel Burke. He's running for the U.S. Senate in New Jersey. He currently does not support universal basic income, and so he wanted to come on to be able to debate the topic. So we'll be learning about his campaign, and we'll be debating on universal basic income. Then we'll be having talks next week with a gamut of more congressional candidates. Be back here at 9 p.m. Eastern time every day, Monday through Friday. We'll be here continuing to build this movement to bring power to people like you. And, you know, we are going to get to have more universal basic income conversations over time. So I'm really looking forward to doing our first presentation, which will start on Mondays, on why these policies are important. The first presentation I'll be doing is what I would be designing as my own universal basic income plan. So I look forward to having that conversation as well. Thank you all for tuning in. Brian, thank you again for coming on today's episode. I hope you all are staying safe out there. And as always, I hope you guys stay rosy.